Welcome to Live with the Author. I'm Amanda Goodwin, and I'm one of the editors of Reading Research Quarterly. And we have with us today two of our wonderful special issue authors. Welcome, Courtney Hattan and Sarah Lupo.
Hello.
Great to be here.
Thanks so much for joining us. I'm so excited to chat about your article and what it means to research and instruction. And that makes me wonder, how did you guys get into this topic?
So I think for both of us, our work is grounded in our experiences as former teachers and teacher educators, and also in our own empirical research. But parts of, at least for me, my work really does focus on knowledge activation and helping students activate and access the vast knowledges that they have, specifically when they're reading a topic or a text about or a text that they have a low level of topic knowledge on. So within that is this inherent assumption that students actually do have background knowledge and they have knowledge to bring with them to the table. So what has been a little bit frustrating for me recently has been this current popular discourse and public discourse around content knowledge. And this discourse seems to assume that students, especially students who do come from non-dominant backgrounds, are these empty pails that need to be filled, rather than these humans and these beings who bring with them a lot of knowledge and experiences to each literacy and learning experience. So part of this article is meant to be sort of a response to this popular discourse that's been happening. And even though we agree that content knowledge is really important, we also want to acknowledge the knowledge that students do have.
Well, and that seems to be the whole heart of the issue and what its contribution to the science of reading is. Would you guys have any thoughts about what teachers should do based off of the findings of your study?
Sure, I'll take that one. So teachers, I think, were really at the heart of every spot of this writing process for us. And I'd say they're at the heart of everything that I write. I hope that teachers will take away how to approach knowledge from a strength-based perspective, similar to what Courtney just shared. Like, we really feel like we want to push back a little bit about this idea that there's a gap, because we feel it can lead to some practices that don't actually support the learning from text, which is really the whole goal of this idea to build knowledge. I think there are some dangers of approaching children from that perspective, and we think that it actually could hinder some of those goals. While we're not opposed and we actually really are in favor of content knowledge building, I think that the idea of building knowledge has to center on kids using their knowledge in order to learn from text. And that was one reason I was really excited about this piece. I had sort of stumbled onto it a little bit by accident through my last study, where I discovered that KWLs were so useful. And that very idea of, like, we really need to activate what kids know to help them learn from text, I think is something that we want teachers to take away, as well as like some practical ideas about how to activate, integrate, and revise knowledge while supporting students, like using visual organizers, concept maps, diagrams to show how what they know is related to what they're learning in the text to help them integrate that. And
So
then I also, oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, talk to me a little bit. I keep hearing this like strength-based approach, which is so important. I keep hearing, honoring students, but still building content knowledge. So you guys are former teachers. You've probably been out and you've taught, but then you've also probably been out visiting lots of classrooms. What does this look like? What's a classroom that you've walked into and like applauded because you're seeing what you want versus something that we should be wary of?
I can take that one. So something that I think is really important to consider is what knowledge is being valued in this conversation or in the texts that are being utilized. So are we only centering dominant white middle class voices and perspectives, or are we also using texts that are complex texts that are challenging for students, but that center not only characters and perspectives that might support Black, Indigenous, and people of color, but that also are written from the perspectives of the people who live and live within those communities. So it's centering different types of knowledge, and just like Dr. Bishop talks about, of like providing windows and mirrors for students, but then also helping to activate their knowledge. And this is a process that doesn't occur automatically. I think that a lot of times there's this assumption that if you give a child a text, they will automatically connect to it. And instead, what we're trying to do is demonstrate that teachers can support and build on what students know, and use very strategic questioning to get students to access what they already know, and then make more meaningful connections to what's happening in text, and hopefully texts that do center counter narratives, or what might typically be considered a counter narrative.
So as a teacher, would you want folks to read what might be more of a traditional narrative and then also a counter narrative? Or how do we do both? How do we build this kind of general content knowledge, but then how do we also honor this broader view of content knowledge and this idea that there are two sides to stories, and there's perspectives, and there's biases out there?
Yeah, I'll try this one. I love the idea of multiple texts, and we do talk about that in our piece, and that's one of the types of knowledge that we suggest teachers focus on. And so I do think that approaching teaching content and building knowledge through the use of multiple texts, different text types, different perspectives, I think is really the answer there. And that's one thing I get really excited about when I walk into classrooms, when I see students reading things, multiple things about a topic, things that contradict each other, and they have to sort of make sense of that, things that contradict what they believe and what they think is true, and they have to make sense of that. And we know that there's just so much cognitive growth that can happen from that, as well as strengthening of their reading skills, and as well as strengthening their learning about that content.
Very cool. So what does your paper mean for principals and policymakers?
I think that for principals and policymakers, I would encourage them to not think of anything about like there being a silver bullet when it comes to knowledge and literacy, particularly, and also for any sort of idea or anything that has to do with education. But even if school leaders are adapting more of a knowledge building curriculum, I think it's important to provide teachers with the space that they need to be critical of that curriculum and utilize and bring in those other types of texts that we were just talking about, so that they're not sort of drawn to only using the curriculum that's available to them, but also using texts that acknowledge and center various types of cultural and linguistic backgrounds.
That sounds so important. And so what does this mean to families, to parents?
Um, well, I think as a parent myself, I try to never veer away from really challenging texts with my kids. I do try to bring in content area texts and all kinds of different texts rather than just reading fiction texts with my kids. And I just hope that parents aren't afraid to read texts that they might think are hard or that have lots of complex language and words. I also think that parents can use the same advice that we've given teachers as they're reading with their children. Anything, have children think about what they know so that they're integrating their knowledge as they read. What do you know about this topic? Even if it's something small or tangentially related, getting kids to think about what they know can really help them learn from those texts. I love the idea of relational reasoning, which I think is something easily you could do as a parent as you're reading with kids, and have kids think about what's similar or different in their own knowledge set to what they're reading, and how that varies. And I really hope that parents aren't afraid to push back on negative labels that they might be given by schools, such as low knowledge or knowledge gap, if those are presented or insinuated about their own children.
And when I'm listening to you, I'm hearing like read a lot, expose lots of content, talk a lot, but I'm also kind of taking away from the broader conversation, like challenge yourself to expose your kids to the windows and the mirrors, to the books that are, you would typically expose them to as part of your own culture. But I'm thinking that part of my job as a parent might also be to pick up books that might be about others, or purposely think about books that might present different perspectives, and have my kid help me reason through these things that we might think are so simple or more
Yeah.
complex.
And we suggest that in terms of building cultural knowledge. And we think that that's particularly important for white families from the majority, you know, populations, because the windows and the mirrors are extra important. The windows in particular are extra important if you're from a majority culture.
And what does your work mean for researchers? How do we take this perspective and move ourselves forward as a field?
Yeah, I think it's really important to not be grounded or really root our research in these more deficit terms like knowledge gap, achievement gap, at-risk students, and kind of shifting away from that kind of language that we're using to describe students. But also, I think it's really important to consider multiple theoretical perspectives, as well as empirical research that does come from these different methodologies, because I think these varying perspectives really do add to our collective understanding about knowledge and literacy. And it's important to talk to rather than just past one another. So if we're able to find ways to draw upon these different and varying ideas, that can be really important. And in particular, this might be a little bit nitpicky, but I sometimes get frustrated with the way that knowledge is talked about. So just being clear in defining what we mean by knowledge. So if we're writing an article that has to do about knowledge, what type of knowledge are you talking about? I think a lot of times content knowledge or topic knowledge is sort of assumed, but there are these other types of knowledge. So admitting if you're taking a very narrow view of knowledge and only focusing on topic knowledge, or are you broadening your perspective and really focusing on all of these other types of knowledges that we talk about in our article?
Fascinating. Can you give us some examples of those other types of knowledges?
Yeah, so we talk in our article, we provide some other ideas for types of knowledge that are really important to reading, but it's not meant to be like a comprehensive list. So I don't want anyone to be like, wait, you didn't talk about this or that. It's not comprehensive, but we focus on cultural and linguistic knowledge, as well as this idea of principled knowledge, which goes beyond content knowledge and really focuses on deep conceptual knowledge. And then we also talk about knowledge of multiple texts and multimodal texts, as well as something called conditional knowledge. And that's understanding when and why you might use other forms of knowledge that you have. And then also strategic knowledge. So even though there is a focus on content knowledge, it is also important for students to have strategic knowledge to know how to attack a text and to be able to break it down in different ways.
So basically that kind of broad view of knowledge. It makes me kind of wonder, as we're like chatting, what are some takeaway messages that you hope researchers, teachers, practitioners, policymakers, principals, parents take away from this conversation?
I can. Sorry.
Either way.
Yeah, so I think some big takeaway messages are to value students' knowledge, to help them access, integrate, and revise their knowledge, to broaden our definition of what we mean by knowledge. And then also, I think to acknowledge the complexity of literacy instruction. So instead of saying, I think we typically stay in these different silos and instead understanding that literacy is not simple, it is complex, and we can build on multiple perspectives from multiple studies and the vast empirical work that is out there in order to be able to better serve students and be better educators.
I love it. I think it's well said. One thing I was wondering as I was listening is you talked about valuing students' knowledge. To me, that means you also have to know what students know. What are some ideas that you guys have for getting to know what students and families know?
I can try that. One thing that I just had my students do recently is create a content and interest inventory that they were going to give to their students that they are working with this semester. So I think that you can spend a lot of time getting to know students, but I really think some kind of broad inventory where students can write about what they're interested in, what they know. And I think that even reaching out to families and having families do something similar is a really great way. I've loved doing literacy nights in the past where you're inviting families to come and share what they know and share their knowledge, and inviting different families to present about things that they have a lot of knowledge about.
So it seems like this big key of getting to know your students, valuing their knowledge, and then also exposing them to a broad range of knowledge and a broad range of perspectives. And I loved the question you said, like, whose knowledge is it that we're thinking about? Well, thank you guys so much for being with us. It's always fascinating. And I know these are things that I like call on right away. You know, these are the kinds of things you said, mentioned working with teacher candidates. These are the questions we're asking in class on a daily basis. And these are actually the questions that I'm also trying to ask my 4-year-old. You know, whose knowledge, like who are these people? Whose perspectives are these? Are there different perspectives? Because I think really early on, kids are noticing the way
Yeah.
the world works, and we need to push back on that.
It's true.
Great. Well, thanks so much for being with us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks
And
for
if you
having
want,
us.
and if you want to read more, you can find Courtney and Sarah's article in our special issue, and it's entitled "Rethinking the Role of Knowledge in the Literacy Classroom" by Courtney Hattan and Sarah Lupo. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.